Hello, my name is Jeffrey Kotick, and I'm a researcher of medieval East Asia. For several years, I've been looking at the history of astrology and astrological iconography in various parts of the world. This sort of comparison has yielded many fruits because what we find is that various cultures of the ancient and medieval world shared a common heritage in their astral sciences because much of what they practiced could be extended back to earlier cultures in different geographic regions. And so today I'm going to talk about the specific icon of Saturn. Now, if we go back to some of the early depictions of Kronos in the Greco-Egyptian tradition, we can see him as an old man or a bearded man hunched over reaping the wheat. And what we're seeing here is one example of this. So it's a magic stone. And on the opposite side of it is an inscription, Ishkon, which refers to the hip joint, the fleshy parts of the hip joint. So presumably this sort of stone was used to alleviate pain in the lower back and hips caused by manual labor and perhaps even old age. We have to remember that Saturn was associated with agriculture and old age. Here's another example of Kronos reaping the wheat. We'll notice too that he has a pointed cap which will become pronounced in later icons. However, if we look at the icons of the planets in ancient India, what we find is that they don't necessarily have these specific characteristics that we see in the Hellenistic world and also in the later Persian and Arabic worlds, as we'll discuss shortly. In this case, we can see that Rahu is a decapitated head with his hands, but the other icons, apart from Ketu with the serpent's tail, are not necessarily unique. The astral pantheon was transmitted from India into China initially in the 8th century by monks such as Shubhakara Simha, who translated an important esoteric Buddhist text called the Vairochana Abhisambodhi into Chinese. And this text included an illustrated mandala. So a mandala is a chart or a complex illustration that displays the deities in specific positions with specific features. And on the outer rim, we see the deities of the planets, the zodiac signs, and also the lunar mansions. So there's this document from Japan, Taizo Zuzo, which preserves the illustrations as they were transmitted from China to Japan, and this is a copy of a Chinese original. And we can see that it was probably a Chinese artist who executed these icons, but nevertheless the motifs and so forth are Indian in origin. In this case, Saturn is holding a water vase or some sort of vase or flask that would carry fluids, and he's not necessarily so unique compared to the other planets. But if we step ahead a few centuries and look at documents such as those from Dunhuang and other places, we can see that Saturn is suddenly depicted in a very unique way from the other planetary icons. In this case, he's in the bottom left. He's in front of the bull, and he is depicted as an Indian Brahmin, and he's holding a staff. So this is quite unique compared to the Indian icons that we surveyed just now. Other documents in China preserve these various icons, and so in this case Saturn is riding a bull, and the other icons, for example, Venus is playing a guitar and Mars is a warrior. So these have gendered characteristics and they're holding specific items as well. What we also see in China is the names of the planets in transliterated Sogdian. So if we look on the right column, we have the Chinese characters, which are transcriptions of the Sogdian, which are transcriptions of Middle Persian. Now, the ancient Persians named their planets after various gods following the Mesopotamian custom, and this was also the case in the Greek world. And thus we still call the planets using their Latin names after the gods, so Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, etc. And this was also the case with the Persians. And so this custom was introduced also into China, but then the Chinese also simultaneously used their indigenous names for the planets. So what we're looking at essentially is a transmission of Iranian icons into China sometime around the 8th or 9th centuries. And if we look closer at the icons and start comparing them to what we see in the Islamicate world, we can see very strong parallels. So on the left-hand side here, we see Saturn and Libra as old men hunched over, grasping onto the middle of their chests. Now, in this case, it's very clear that there's a parallel with what we see in the Wonders of Creation on the right side. He's seated, but I think that's artistic license. In this case, probably the original icon had him hunched over. He also has what appears to be a leopard skin skirt, and that's also what we see in the icon of Saturn on the left. Now, the reason that Libra would be grasping his chest in this way is because Libra is associated with that part of the body traditionally in astrological lore. And also Saturn finds his exaltation in the zodiac sign of Libra. Now, if we compare the icons with what we see in the Greco-Egyptian world as well as the later Islamicate context, we can see that there's very clearly some sort of connection here. In this case, the East Asian icon of Saturn is clearly linked somehow with the original Greco-Egyptian icon of Kronos reaping the wheat. And similarly, I think the Islamicate icon also derives from this motif originally. The more mature form of Saturn, however, loses some of those features, and we see him depicted in this form, such as in the Kuyo Hiraku. So this is a Japanese document, which is probably a copy of a Chinese original that dates back to the 9th century. And Saturn is here, he's depicted as a Brahmin, and he's holding a staff and some other sort of instrument, and he's associated with a bull. And later on, this depiction of Saturn, this is a Japanese copy of a earlier Song Dynasty depiction of Saturn. Interestingly here, his staff has a sort of hook at the top, a sickle-like feature at the top. And if we compare that with the sigils that we see in texts such as the Gayatri Hakim, Picatrix, and even the modern symbol for Saturn, we can see that Saturn's staff here has preserved that feature of a sickle-like shape. So this is an interesting example of an East Asian depiction of Saturn that carries over this sigil or this symbol of Saturn. So the Chinese word for Saturn, Jihuan, which would have pronounced something like Kwan in Middle Chinese, so medieval Chinese, refers to Saturn. So this is a transcription of Sogdian Kwan, and this can be traced back to Middle Persian, and the Middle Persian is a transcription of the Akkadian Kaiwanu. So essentially, the word for Saturn in medieval Chinese was a 3rd or 4th generation loanword from Akkadian, ultimately. Other depictions of Saturn, such as in the Tangut Kingdom. So the Tangut Kingdom was a small kingdom that existed between Tibet and China in the medieval period, and it was destroyed mostly by the Mongols. But they were very much interested in astrology, and in this case we see Saturn here depicted as a Brahmin, but the artist understood a Brahmin as having red hair, which makes me think that perhaps the idea or the conception of a Brahmin was somehow influenced by North Indian, perhaps Kashmiri figures, but that's just conjecture on my part. In this other famous painting dating to the early Song Dynasty, we have Saturn here depicted as a Brahmin riding a bull, and it's interesting that we have him riding a bull because we also have instances of that in the Indian context, such as this one text called the Lagna Chandrika, and this is a text studied by David Pingree, and so here it's very clear that Shani is riding a bull. Comparing the icon of Libra with the Kitab al-Bulhan, we can see that again we have Saturn grasping onto his chest because the zodiac sign of Libra is associated with that part of the body. In the depictions of the planets by Al-Nasiri, we can see similar features. Again, he is holding various instruments and he's seated in a chair, but one gets the impression that this icon that he's supposed to be originally hunched over, but the artists provided chairs for the different deities. In this one Persian manuscript, which I believe is from India, that's in the Welcome collection, we see this Islamicate icon kind of mixed with the Indian feature where he is riding an elephant. So in other Indian depictions, sometimes Saturn is seen riding an elephant. When we look to Europe, however, the image of Kronos is heavily influenced by Greek myth. So often he's depicted holding and devouring a child, and that goes back to the old Greek myth of Kronos, the Titan, where he received the prophecy that he would be overthrown by his children, so he consumed all of them. However, Zeus managed to avoid this fate and deposed his father. And so this sort of image is reproduced in a lot of the Renaissance era depictions of Saturn. And so here's another famous example from Germany in the 16th century of Saturn eating his children. Interestingly, Saturn is usually depicted riding in a chariot pulled by dragons, and we don't see that anywhere in East Asia as far as I've seen so far. And that's very much unique to Europe. And instead of holding a sickle, he's holding a scythe, or the instrument that you use to cut grass. So this was my discussion on Saturn. I hope you found it informative.